I thought it was just a dinner. Our first big family gathering since the wedding, my brand new dining table set for 12, the candles I'd spent an hour arranging flickering warm gold against the crystal wine glasses. And then my husband leaned close to my ear and whispered the 4 words that unraveled absolutely everything I thought I knew about our marriage. "Could you eat in the kitchen?" Not a question. Not really. More of an assumption dressed up in a question mark. Not directed at his sisters, who had arrived 40 minutes late and claimed every available chair. Not directed at his mother, Brenda, who sat at the head of my table with the serene confidence of a woman who had already decided she owned the room. Directed at me. In my house. The house I'd bought 3 years before I ever met Daniel, whose every square foot I knew because I'd stripped the wallpaper myself, painted the trim myself, chosen the hardwood floors after 6 months of obsessing over samples. The house where my name, and only my name, appeared on the deed. That was the night I realized my marriage was not what I thought it was. And that realization, I would soon discover, was only the very beginning. My name is Clara, and I am 34 years old, and until 18 months ago, I believed I had built a genuinely good life. Not perfect. I have never been foolish enough to believe in perfect, but solid, real, built on genuine effort and a stubborn optimism I'd inherited from my father. I had a career I was proud of, senior project manager at an architecture firm, a position I'd worked toward over 8 years of early mornings and weekends where my laptop was never fully closed. I had savings, a modest investment portfolio, and the house, always. Above everything else, the house. A 3-bedroom craftsman in a leafy neighborhood outside the city, with original built-ins and a bay window in the dining room that flooded the space with afternoon light that made you feel, briefly, that everything was going to be fine. Bought at 29 with a down payment scraped together over 5 careful years. I loved it with the ferocity of someone who had earned every square foot through choices that cost her something real. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's birthday party, and he was, I want to be precise here because it is easy to rewrite history in retrospect, genuinely warm when I met him. Funny in a quiet way, self-deprecating, with the easy social charm of someone who has spent his whole life learning how to make people comfortable. He made me comfortable. That felt significant because I am not naturally an easy person to relax. I carry tension in my shoulders. I overthink. I solve problems before they exist. Around Daniel, I exhaled. Something in me that was always slightly braced simply let go, and I mistook that release for safety. We dated 2 years before he moved into my house. He accepted my terms without argument, signed the cohabitation agreement my father insisted I draft with an actual attorney, and settled in with a grateful ease that felt, at the time, like emotional maturity. His mother, Brenda, shared her opinion about the arrangement exactly once. At a dinner, early in our relationship, in a voice pitched at the precise frequency of warm concern. I just find it a little unusual, she said, cutting her chicken with unhurried precision. A man living in a woman's house, it sets a strange dynamic, don't you think? Daniel said, Mom. Brenda smiled and moved on to the asparagus, and the subject closed with such graceful finality that I almost admired it. I told myself it was nothing, the way you tell yourself the first crack in a wall is just the house settling. That was the first time I told myself it was nothing. It would not, by an enormous margin, be the last. We married 14 months later, a small ceremony in my backyard, the bay window glowing amber behind the officiant in late afternoon light. Brenda attended in a cream-colored dress, a completely innocent wardrobe choice, depending on your level of generosity, and embraced me warmly and said she was so glad we were family now. I believed her, or I wanted to believe her so completely that I didn't examine the distance between those two things. In the months following the wedding, wanting and believing looked identical from the inside. Brenda visited every 6 weeks, always with 2 days' notice, always carrying something warm, a chicken casserole, a fruit pie, that she'd set on my kitchen counter with the quiet authority of a woman depositing something into her own home. She never said anything overtly hostile. That was the genius of it. Every comment wore a socially acceptable interpretation like a coat. This kitchen gets so dark in the afternoon. Have you thought about new lighting? The master bath tile is lifting at the corner. You should have Daniel look at that. The neighborhood is noisier than I remembered. Heavier curtains might help. Each landed in me like a small cold stone dropped from a height, and I could never quite articulate to anyone who might have taken me seriously why they bothered me. They were observations. They were helpful. What was my problem? In the autumn after our first anniversary, the question shifted in a way I registered but couldn't name precisely. Brenda began asking about finances, not bluntly, never bluntly, but with the sideways curiosity of someone who needed information for reasons she hadn't disclosed. Are you still saving as aggressively as before, with Daniel's income in the mix? She asked once, sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of tea. You must feel so much more secure now. Another time during a Sunday lunch, have you two looked into refinancing? With joint ownership, you'd qualify for better rates, I'd imagine. I said we hadn't discussed it. She smiled and said she was sure we'd figure out what was best. I noticed that Daniel, both times, was looking at his plate. Daniel occupied the careful middle space between defending me and not defending me. A half smile, a light, "Mom, Clara likes it this way." A hand briefly on my shoulder before his attention moved elsewhere. Enough to forestall open conflict, not enough to constitute an actual choice. The dinner party was my idea. I had just closed the most significant contract of my career, a full commercial renovation project that would anchor the next 2 years of my work life, and I wanted to mark it. I spent 3 weeks planning. The menu, the flowers, the seating arrangement. I bought 6 new dining chairs to supplement my existing 6, wrote place cards in my best handwriting, made bread from scratch the morning of. I set the table the afternoon before and stood back and looked at it. The candles, the folded napkins, the cards lined up just so, and felt a quiet, private pride I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Brenda arrived 45 minutes early. She did this sometimes, and I had chalked it up to punctuality. What I understand now is that those early minutes were a working window. Daniel alone in the kitchen, the candles unlit, me still changing upstairs. By the time I came downstairs, she had rearranged the appetizer board, shifted 2 of my flower arrangements, and was deep in a low, rapid conversation with Daniel that stopped with the completeness of a closing door when I appeared. "Clara," she said, pivoting immediately, warmth arriving so fast it seemed preloaded. "Everything looks absolutely beautiful." She gestured around my dining room as though it were something I had borrowed and returned in improved condition. I thanked her. I lit the candles. I told myself it was nothing. Daniel's sisters arrived together, 40 minutes late, trailing husbands and children and the careless energy of people who have never learned to treat someone else's home with consideration. Coats dropped on my entryway chairs. Children ran to the living room without asking. The place cards at the table had been rearranged. Not dramatically, but enough. I absorbed it. I am good at absorbing things. It was when I returned to the dining room with the last of the first course that I noticed there were no longer 12 chairs at my table. There were 11. Mine, the one nearest the kitchen door, with my place card still propped against the water glass, had been relocated to the living room, where it now served as a surface for one of the children's juice cups. Nobody had asked. Nobody had thought to mention it. It had simply been taken because it was available, because removing it created no friction for anyone already seated at my table. I stood in the doorway for a moment that felt longer than it was. The candles were doing exactly what I'd hoped. The light was warm. My table looked beautiful, and I had been quietly excised from it. Daniel appeared at my elbow, speaking low. "There aren't enough chairs. Could you eat in the kitchen tonight? Just for tonight. It's easier." I set down what I was carrying with deliberate care. "This is my house," I said. The words came out calm and level, which surprised me because what I felt was not calm at all. "I know," he said. "I know that, Clara. But everyone's already seated and it's just one." "This is my house," I said again. "My table, my chairs. I bought every single chair at that table, and you are asking me to eat in the kitchen." The shame on his face was real. I believed that, but it was not enough to make him change course. "Please," he said quietly, "just tonight." "I'll get a chair from the garage," I said. The look that crossed his face then, that is what I keep returning to. Not embarrassment. Something underneath it that looked almost like alarm. The expression of a man who has made a careful calculation and suddenly discovered a variable he hadn't accounted for. It lasted 1 second. Then his face rearranged itself, and he said, "Okay," in a tone that gave nothing away, and I went to the garage and retrieved the folding chair and placed it at my table and sat down in my own house. Nobody commented. Brenda smiled at me with the warmth of someone extending generous forgiveness for a small, unnecessary scene. I smiled back. I watched Daniel, and I noticed that he did not look at his mother, and she did not look at him, and I filed that away with all the other small things I was tired of calling nothing. 3 days later, looking for a pen in the shallow drawer of Daniel's home office desk, my fingers closed around a manila folder I didn't recognize. I almost put it back. I was late for a call. The folder was probably a tax form. I almost put it back. I didn't. The first page was a printed email chain. Sender, Brenda. Recipient, Daniel. Subject line, the property. Options going forward. My hands went very still. Outside, a car passed with its radio briefly audible and then gone. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. The house made all its ordinary sounds while the world I had built inside it began, slowly and without any drama at all, to tilt. I read the chain, 8 exchanges, spanning 6 weeks. The first sent 9 days after our most recent anniversary dinner. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, and by the third reading, my hands were trembling with a fine, continuous shiver that traveled up through my wrists and refused to stop. The emails were numbered in Brenda's handwriting at the top of each page. She had organized them, printed them, placed them here. The organizational detail struck me almost as hard as the content itself. This was not an impulse. This was not a daughter-in-law problem that had spiraled into feeling. This was architecture. Someone had drawn up blueprints. The second email contained a name I didn't recognize. A Gary Holbrook described as a family friend with real estate experience, and a number that looked exactly like a property valuation, my property valuation. The third email discussed timelines. The fourth asked Daniel whether I had ever added him to the deed, or whether the situation remains as it was. His reply was 4 words. I read them slowly, the way you read something in a language you almost but don't quite speak, still just her name. I set the folder on the desk. I sat in my husband's chair for a long moment without moving. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. My father answered on the second ring. He always does. In 34 years, I have never timed it differently. I told him what I'd found. I read him the subject line. I described the emails, the name Gary Holbrook, the property valuation, the timelines, and Daniel's 4-word reply at the bottom of the chain, still just her name. My voice held for most of it. It broke on those 4 words, not from grief, but from something colder, the specific shock of discovering that your private life has been discussed, assessed, and strategized around by people who smiled at you across your table and called you family. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't put the folder back. Photograph every page before you do anything else." A pause. "And don't talk to Daniel tonight, not until you've spoken to Patricia." Patricia was his family attorney. Compact, dry, unhurried, with the calm of someone who has seen enough human behavior to be surprised by very little. I had her number from the cohabitation agreement. I photographed all 8 emails and both attachments. The second attachment was titled Marital Asset Clarification Agreement, and it had a signature line with my name on it. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I walked to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and stood waiting for the water to boil, while outside the window the afternoon light moved across the neighbor's fence, exactly as it always had, and everything looked exactly the same, and I understood for the first time how completely a life can be threatened from the inside, while its surface remains perfectly intact. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside Daniel in the dark and listened to him breathe with the steady rhythm of a man who was not, apparently, kept awake by the contents of his own desk drawer. I thought about 4 words typed and sent, and then followed by a kiss on my cheek and a beer and dinner at my kitchen island. I thought about the flowers rearranged on the counter, the sideways questions about refinancing and joint ownership, the look on his face when I said I'd get a chair from the garage, that flash of something that wasn't embarrassment but was adjacent to alarm. I thought about what I had been, in this house, in this marriage, a resource being quietly assessed. The thought didn't come as melodrama. It came as geometry, flat and irrefutable. I met with Patricia 2 days later. She read through the photographs without expression, scrolling slowly, going back twice to reread the attachments. When she set the phone down, she looked at me with the directness of a woman who doesn't believe in softening things unnecessarily. "Your ownership isn't at risk," she said. "Your name alone is on the deed, and nothing in these emails changes that. The concerning element is this draft agreement." She tapped the phone. "If a signed version of this document existed, even a contested one, it would create a basis for expensive, protracted litigation. The name on that signature line is yours." She paused. "If someone were to present a signed version you never signed, that would be criminal forgery." I researched Gary Holbrook when I got back to my car. It took 4 minutes. His notary license had been suspended 4 years ago for irregularities in document certification. He currently worked, informally, for a property developer who was Brenda's neighbor. The folder in Daniel's desk had not been placed there carelessly. That evening, I made dinner as I always did. 2 plates. Daniel came home at 6:30, kissed my cheek, opened a beer. He was warm. He was easy. He was the man I had married, the one I exhaled around, who remembered how I took my coffee. I watched him move around my kitchen and understood, with a clarity more devastating than anger, that both things were simultaneously true. He was that man. He was also a man who had typed "still," just her name, to his mother and then come home and kissed my cheek. I waited until we'd finished eating. I cleared the plates. Then I sat across from him and said, "I found the folder in your desk." The color left his face immediately. His eyes went to the counter, the table, a point somewhere between us that was not my face. "Clara." "I read all of it," I said. "Every email, both attachments." He put his beer down with deliberate care. In the silence, I heard the refrigerator and a distant television next door, and the house breathing around us with complete indifference to the fact that everything was falling apart inside it. It's not what it looks like," he said finally. I looked at him and waited. She just worries about security. She brought up the idea of a property agreement, and I told her it wasn't necessary. I told her you'd never... He stopped. I didn't think she'd actually follow through. "You told her my name was still the only name on the deed," I said. "When she asked directly, you told her. And then you came home." He was quiet. I thought I could manage it. I thought if I need to know about Gary Holbrook," I said. Something moved across his face. He looked up, and I had his full attention. "I looked him up," I said, "after I read the emails. His notary license was suspended for document irregularities. He works informally with a property developer your mother knows. The draft agreement in that folder had a signature line with my name on it, a document I never signed." My voice remained level, even, like a surface that won't give. "Tell me how far this actually went." The silence that followed was the longest yet. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice had a flattened quality I had never heard in it before. "She asked him to draft it," he said. "She said it was just a template, to show me what it would look like. I told her it was a bad idea. I told her not to go further." He stopped. "I didn't know she'd put your name on the signature line." I stood up from the island. I turned to the counter and straightened a dish towel on the oven handle and breathed in a way I measured and controlled. "You knew about Holbrook," I said, with my back still to him. "You knew about the agreement. You didn't warn me. You didn't tell her to stop. You told her my name was still the only name on the deed, and you came home." I turned around and looked at him. My husband in my kitchen, in my house. "I'm calling Patricia tomorrow. I'd suggest you tell your mother." Brenda arrived the next morning at 9, 40 minutes after Daniel had left for work. She let herself in with the spare key he'd given her 2 years ago. The key I had never revoked because the conversation felt like too much trouble, and set a Tupperware container on my counter and said we needed to talk things through because these things happen in families, and we were family. 22 minutes of the most technically accomplished manipulation I have ever witnessed in person. She had only wanted security for her son. Gary Holbrook was an old family friend. The document was purely theoretical. The signature line was just formatting, a placeholder completely standard. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, and the warmth of it was so practiced and complete that for one terrible second I felt the old pull of it, the instinct to smooth things over, to accept the offered interpretation, to keep the peace at the cost of the truth. "The signature line," I said. Her hand stayed on mine. Her expression did not change. "I don't know what you mean, sweetheart." "My name," I said, "on the signature line of the marital asset clarification agreement that Gary Holbrook drafted. That's just formatting, a placeholder. Brenda." I said her name the way you close a door, not loudly, but with the full weight of the door behind it. "My attorney is Patricia Webb. I've sent her photographs of every document in that folder, including Mr. Holbrook's name and his licensing history." I paused. "I'd suggest you have whoever advises you contact her directly." The warmth left her face the way light leaves a room at dusk, incrementally, then all at once. What remained was older and harder than the face I'd been looking at for 3 years. She looked at me with eyes that were assessing rather than warm, measuring the distance between what she had expected and what was sitting across from her now. "You're making this into something it isn't," she said. "No," I said. "I'm making it exactly what it is." She left 10 minutes later, taking her Tupperware with her. She did not say goodbye. Patricia filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board regarding Holbrook's involvement with a document bearing a forged signature. The complaint triggered a full review of his prior disciplinary record and led, within 6 weeks, to permanent revocation of his consulting privileges. Criminal prosecution for the forgery was possible, but difficult. The signed document had never been formally presented, which created an evidentiary threshold problem. What happened instead was something Brenda had not anticipated in any version of her plan. Daniel read Patricia's letter outlining the forgery issue. He had not known about the signature line. I believe that. The look on his face was not the look of a man confronted with something he had done. It was the look of a man confronted with something done in his name that he could not now cleanly separate himself from, because he had known enough and said nothing, and that silence had a shape. He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "What do you need from me?" It was the first useful question he had asked in months. I told him what I needed. A full written account of every conversation he had participated in or been aware of. He gave it to me, across 2 weeks and 3 evenings at my kitchen table, talking while I took notes. I understood, fully for the first time, the entire architecture of what had been constructed around me while I was planning a dinner party and making bread and feeling a quiet, private pride in a life I thought was mine. The marriage did not survive. I want to be straightforward about that because these stories are sometimes told as though the enemy is the mother-in-law and the husband is merely weak, and weakness is forgivable. Daniel was weak, but weakness deployed consistently, over months, in the service of someone who intended me harm. That is not a neutral thing. He made choices in small, quiet moments when he could have said something different and chose not to. I do not hate him for it. I stopped being married to him, which is the honest and proportionate response. Brenda did not get the house. She never came close to getting it. The house, as it had always been, belonged to me. 14 months later, on a Saturday morning in early October, I sat on the back step with a cup of coffee and watched the light move across the yard. Low and amber, patient, the particular quality of autumn light that takes its time with everything it touches. I had taken out the rose bushes Daniel had planted because I had never particularly liked them, and they had always been his choice, and replaced them with a small kitchen garden. Herbs, a few late tomatoes still holding on, some lavender along the fence that I was learning, slowly to manage. It was not a perfect garden, it was mine. My father called while I was sitting there. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, his plans for the winter, a book he'd finished. When I hung up, the morning was very still. The house behind me held its quiet in the particular way it had always held it, the way I had known it would hold it when I signed the papers at 29. The lavender moved once in a small wind and settled. I had thought, in the worst months of all of this, that the hardest thing would be losing the marriage. I was wrong. The hardest thing was learning that the warmth I had been offered across 3 years had always had a price tag attached to it that I was never shown. You cannot unmake that knowledge. You can only decide what to do with it, whether to carry it as bitterness or to carry it as information. I chose information. I chose to be someone who looked clearly at things. The house was quiet and the coffee was good and the morning was exactly what I needed it to be.